Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome back to Reinventing Parking. I'm Paul Barter. This time we look at a successful parking reform campaign and get into the weeds of how such a campaign can achieve its goals. To do that, we'll be hearing from Cheryl Cort, who is Policy Director for the Coalition for Smarter Growth, which is a non-profit in the Washington, D.C. region. Cheryl will be talking about the long and difficult effort that she led to persuade the D.C. Council to enact a parking cash-out law. Or I should say, to enact flexible commuter benefits, which is the name that the campaigners found was much more appealing and persuasive. That's just one of the many campaigning insights that we can learn from Cheryl in this episode. In a minute, you'll be hearing a lightly edited version of a webinar event from March 30th this year, which was organised by the non-profit Parking Reform Network. By the way, I want to say here that I really like the Parking Reform Network, and I'd encourage you to join. PRN started in the USA, but it wants to foster and encourage parking change-making all over the world, not just in North America. Being a member will really give your parking change-making efforts a boost. I'm a member, and I am also increasingly trying to integrate my parking efforts into the work of the Parking Reform Network. So you can expect to hear more about PRN in future episodes. You can find out more about the network at parkingreform.org. So, let's hear from Cheryl Cort. The recording starts with an introduction by Michael Kwan, who is one of the co-founders of the Parking Reform Network. We then hear from Cheryl for about 25 minutes, and then there's an interesting question and answer session moderated by Mike. So here we go. I hope you get a lot out of it. I certainly did.
I want to introduce today's speaker, Cheryl Cort, who is the Policy Director at the Coalition for Smarter Growth, or CSG. Cheryl leads research, policy development, and implementation in the areas of transportation, land use, housing, and equitable development. CSG works in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan region. Cheryl has led major policy successes to build a more inclusive and sustainable city and region, including winning adoption of urban street design standards for Prince George's County and reforming the district's 1958 zoning regulations. She's won reforms to antiquated parking policies, including for the Washington, D.C. region's transit agency Metro and the District of Columbia's zoning regulations, which were updated in 2016. More recently, she helped win a parking cash-out law to bring parity between employee parking and sustainable commute benefits in D.C. And with that, Cheryl, we welcome you again, and the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I am here in Washington, D.C., and that's where I've been doing all of my work. And I'm really excited to connect with all of our parking reform compatriots from around, not only around the country, but apparently around the world. So it's exciting to have some international interest in this as well. So I'm going to explain to you what we did and then hope to have enough time to have a good discussion about how some of the things that I learned could be applied elsewhere as you look to taking on this kind of a campaign. We are a regional nonprofit organization in the Washington, D.C. region. We are advocating for walkable, bikeable, inclusive, transit-oriented communities as the most sustainable and equitable way for our D.C. region to grow and provide opportunities for all. And I've been doing this work for many years. Maybe I just start with a definition about what is parking cash out. Parking cash out is the employer commute benefit practice of converting the value of a parking space subsidized by the employer to a cash benefit to that eligible employee. Practical terms, this means someone who is offered a free parking space at work is able to flex the cost of that parking space toward another commute option and keep the remaining cash, or actually just keep the parking space. But it's to try to level the playing field in terms of incentive of how people are commuting to work. Parking cash out is an important policy tool because about 80% of employers provide free parking to their workers. And we know that if you're offered this commute benefit of free parking, you are very likely to take it. On the pie charts here show, this is actually from, this is data that we collected from that was in one of the data and information that we did for our campaign. It shows, these are actually just DC residents who are working in DC. It shows when the employer offers free parking to that resident who's working. Almost 3/4 of them are going to drive alone, and 15% of them would take transit, and 8% would walk or bike. If the employer does not provide free parking to that employee, we have a completely different pie chart where almost half are riding public transit, walk bike rate goes up to 23%, and a little less than 1/4 are in fact driving alone. And then more people are carpooling as well. And this sort of goes to the heart of the argument that, people drive because they need to drive, and you can't, changing incentives about driving and parking aren't really going to change people's behavior very much. This pie chart sort of demolishes that argument. And we know from studies that parking cash out results in a 10 to 20% decrease in drive alone commute trips and vehicle miles traveled. So why DC was a good laboratory for taking on the parking cash out campaign. First of all, I want to say that this obviously is building on, there are local parking cash out policies in other parts of the country, most importantly, California. So we were examining what California was doing and how can we improve upon that. And we do have some good results out of California, though there are some kind of major sort of exceptions that make implementation not nearly as extensive as we would like to see. So in terms of why DC was sort of a good case study, DC is a city state. We're a city state, so we don't have the same like state enabling issues that another city might have in terms of implementation of this kind of policy. DC has actually the largest walk and bike to work rate in the country now at 18%. So we have a really good constituency. And of course, we have most commuters are not driving alone to work. They are walking, biking, or riding transit to work. We have a major transit system. And I think about the third highest transit ridership in the country, but I should double check on that one. And another really important precondition is that in 2014, we passed a pre-tax transit benefits law that requires employers to offer to employees the opportunity to use their own earnings, set them aside pre-tax in order to buy their transit pass, basically. And also, DC's long-range transportation plan does recommend parking cash out as a good transportation demand management tool. Talking about kind of how we formulated the campaign, I'd say one of the big sort of landmarks was sort of this impetus, or the kind of precursor to it was the Sustainable DC Omnibus Act of 2013, which is where it requires a pre-tax transit benefit. We tried to get parking cash out into that as an amendment, but we were not successful. So we knew we had to sort of give it a go as a standalone bill. And in fact, ultimately, we amended the provision for pre-tax transit benefits in this act. That's actually what the legislation was. So we, looked around to how are we going to promote parking cash out either voluntarily or legislatively, and we looked for natural allies. We looked for expert volunteers. We have sort of a wealth of really talented, generous experts in the field who were able to crunch data for us and really give us a lot of good guidance. Our Regional Bicyclist Association, WABA, was a huge part of a really important partner. We have a local pedestrian advocacy group called All Walks DC, and important people who were involved with that were really important to our campaign. DC Sierra Club came in and who was a big supporter. Black Women Bike is more of a social group, but also very supportive. And then there are these bike and pedestrian advisory councils that were created through legislation. And they were a great way to connect to people from each part of the city so that you could always sort of be in contact with someone who might be particularly important for a legislator you might be having a hard time finding good constituents for. And they were tracking legislation and what the government was doing. So they were helpful. I put in parentheses workforce development groups because I reached out to workforce development groups working with folks who were really reliant on transit to get to work or to have reliable transit to get to work, and was not so successful. They were a lot more interested in just making transit more affordable. And I think that probably a lot of the people they were working with were just trying to get jobs, keep their jobs, get a transit pass, basically. And so we supported them in that, but didn't get much engagement from workforce development groups and similar groups. We did an online survey with our members, and we uncovered some really useful, it uncovered the only parking cash out programs that we found in the city was through our online survey from people on our database. We identified businesses that had an interest in sustainability. Those businesses basically are architecture firms and transportation planners or transportation consultants and a few others. And then we also had a pretty robust education and research component of this, both to make sure that our pre-tax transit benefits was a successful program getting implemented since it was new, and also research on and education around parking cash out more generally. And I'm really grateful that Transit Center was able to provide a grant for that. Okay, so I'm going to try to quickly go through the timeline. It's actually a very long timeline, which I just say it was not easy to pass this legislation, but we ultimately were successful. December 2014, we met with a new council member who'd just been elected. He was a very exciting, someone who really sort of understood what really was speaking our language. We asked him if he would be willing to sponsor a bill to create a parking cash out requirement for employers who were providing a parking benefit to their employees. And I'll say specifically that the idea is that if an employer is providing a parking subsidy, then why can't we just have that subsidy in a mode neutral form so that employees could choose how they wanted to spend the money that the employer has already decided to allocate for a commute benefit. So we secured the commitment from Ward 6 council member elect at the time, Charles Allen, to do that legislation. We were also starting to ramp up outreach and education. And we did an event in February, and that was sort of more of an educational event. DC Department of Transportation was a part of that to talk about their programs, and also actually Transit Center had just published a terrific book called Subsidizing Congestion on parking subsidies. And finally, we were sort of working on getting the bill introduced. It actually took a while to get the bill introduced because we needed to secure the other key sponsor for the bill, and that actually took a while, took some work, and ultimately we were able to introduce it in March of 2017. We did outreach to employers, figuring out every way we could find, get more involved with things that I didn't know a lot about, like finding personnel directors at businesses to understand how they look at commuter benefits. And we're really fortunate to have had this grant from Transit Center to work on sort of the research and education around parking cash out to actually do focus groups. And those focus groups are covered in a fair amount of detail in our publication. So I'd really recommend that folks who are thinking about taking this on, I'll go into a little bit more detail, but there's a lot more detail in our publication that we posted on our website about the focus groups, because it's really useful. We, continue to do outreach, but we were put into a transportation committee, which we had expected, but it was we knew we didn't have three bill supporters. We had two bill supporters, the chair of the committee, transportation committee, and Charles Allen, the Ward 6 council member. But we needed a third vote, so we knew this was going to be tough. We finally got a hearing in late September. We had a good showing. I had spent a lot of time reaching out to businesses. Since this was a business regulation, I knew that I really needed to demonstrate that businesses could support this legislation. So we had 16 witnesses testify in support, 3 were against, 5 of them were employers, and the Department of Transportation testified in support of the bill. And so that was obviously huge. We had pointed out to them that it was in their long-range plan, And so anyway, so that was super helpful. We really went to work doing even really sort of doubling down on reaching out to the council members who we needed to vote on this. And I will say that also during this time, I was learning more about human resources managers and how they look at benefits, and had a lot of useful conversations with them. We were trying to see if we could actually get some organizations or companies to implement a parking cash out program, because there were very few. We found very few. And so we were trying to just get something going sort of voluntarily, which we never got going voluntarily. And I'll go back to a little bit more about our business outreach after I sort of go through the timeline. So we, sort of trudged along, and we actually published our paper before we passed the law. So the timelines here stops in 2018. I'm going to move to the next slide, which is basically our addendum. Kind of going back to January 2018, we had meetings. The main meetings were with the DC Chamber of Commerce, with the hospital and university lobbyists. They didn't like the bill very much, but nothing much happened. The bill actually got reintroduced in 2019. And this time it actually exempted employer-owned parking. And this was a thing that was very painful for us. We didn't want to do it, but it was really the way we were going to move it forward with the one of the bill's key sponsors, and certainly was we had hoped was going to really allay the opposition of hospitals and universities. We still didn't have a lot going on in 2019. Something important happened in 2019 in August, which is the person that we thought we could get a third vote from, the Ward 4 council member, drew a very viable primary challenger. And that started to change the politics of this committee composition. So in October, so you're seeing this is a long time, things not really happening. In October, there was this Open Streets event. So we decided to launch a little petition canvas at the Open Streets event because it went through Ward 4. And we collected over 200 signatures and almost 100 in Ward 4. We set up very visibly. There's a photo of me and a transit advocate. We wore these sandwich boards that said, "Green your commute, ask Councilmember Todd to support flexible commute benefits." And then we got another meeting. We'd had a couple meetings with these council members. We got another meeting with him, and he committed to supporting it in December 2019. We voted on it in January 2020, even though it said that it was a unanimous vote. We really struggled with one of the council members who kept on council member from Ward 5 kept on voicing concerns. And at the same time, there was another council member who we didn't even try to get onto the board with, who was on the committee, Jack Evans. He actually had quit due to a corruption investigation during this period. So that actually dampened the opposition because the strongest opponent was no longer on the committee and no longer on the council. So we got the votes through in March and April, final votes. And though we had to keep kind of fighting for it because the Ward 5 council member continued to question and kind of throw things in the last minute, we were able to get it through. But as you can see, it took quite a few years. I just want to review a couple of the sort of the key points of what I think can be applicable, the public outreach, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the focus group, because this is so important when you're pitching the idea of parking cash out. We tested things like, should we call it parking cash out or should we call it flexible commuter benefits? Focus group said you should call it flexible commuter benefits. So we do that on our website. Parking cash out is kind of a wonky term. We all know what it means because we're really into parking reform, but don't call it that to the general public. Use inclusive language, talk about choice and flexibility. Avoid talk about fairness, which might surprise some of you because we can certainly think about why or make an argument for why it's unfair that, say, a worker who doesn't own a car and pays to ride the bus every day to work and is offered a parking space would really like to have the value of that parking space in cash so that she can pay for her bus that way. That seems fair to us. It seems quite unfair that she doesn't get that option, but that is not how people necessarily perceive it. And specifically in terms of the walk and bike commute, I used to talk up the walk and bike commute a lot since it's so many people walk and bike to work. It turns out that paying people to walk or bike is perceived as unfair because their commute is cheap or free, and they're lucky enough to live near their jobs. So those were not winning arguments. So what winning arguments are giving people flexibility and choice to make decisions that best fit their lives. They might want to drive sometimes, and they might want to ride the bus another time. And also the walk, bike, commute perception is that those are affluent people. It's not true. The walkers earn less than drivers do, but it's still sort of this perception that the middle class driver is being unfairly treated by a parking cash out requirement. We got good earned media. We got some not so good earned media. This photo I have of from Channel 4 was a terrific story, just man on the street. He's like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I don't have a car or whatever. So the media was a little tricky. We got some great media, and there's a business sponsored think tank that did a total hit piece on us. It was very negative. We responded in a local urbanist blog called Greater Washington. Also, the sneaker subsidy was not our messaging. I would not use it, but that's what the media was picking up on. So business outreach was critical. This is a business regulation, so you need to spend a lot of time talking to businesses. We got a total of 19 letters of support, and we got 5 to testify. It was a huge undertaking to find businesses who were willing to write a letter saying, yeah, I'm totally good with the new regulation. We ended up relying mostly, but not exclusively, on leaders that we already knew, people who were in a position to make a decision, like a principal in an architecture firm or a transportation consulting firm, to write that. Universities did not turn out to be very friendly, despite the fact that they usually talk a lot about sustainability. I spent a lot of time reaching out to universities and got really no real support from them. I had sort of 2 tracks. One was to work with human resource managers to both understand how they do commuter benefits and also look at how we could make it work, that they could do a parking cash out. Many were interested and thought it was interesting and receptive, but it's sort of hard to kind of redo an existing system. It's very it tends to be pretty set in their ways. On the one hand, was trying to find employers to embrace this and do it. And ultimately, I found that all I ultimately needed from a legislative perspective was to get business leaders to write me a letter of support for the legislation. I didn't actually have to care whether or not they were implementing parking cash out, because if we passed the law, they would be. And or basically, and here's the other thing, a lot of them didn't have, so I have a little bit of outside noise. A lot of these not very many of these businesses, very few of them provided parking as a benefit for their employees. A lot of them provided, obviously they had to provide pre-tax, and some provided some transit benefit, and 1 or 2 provided a bike benefit. And so I kind of abandoned the effort at some point of trying to find employers who would actually implement a new parking cash out program. It's a little bit like how to lobby the bill. It's like find all your best experts, build your alliances with all the folks that you collaborate in a lot of good progressive stuff with. Find a legislator who's really going to champion your bill, and map that strategy through how you're going to get that bill through the committee process, and go out and you got to spend a lot of time to find businesses to support it. It's going to be really important, especially say in the wards of just ultimately volume is really important. I had to convince a council member who's like, how many business letters do you have? And so it was really important to say that I had 19 business letters of support, because we had the Chamber of Commerce on the other hand saying this is terrible and we shouldn't do it. Engage your Department of Transportation. They can always be helpful if they're at all sympathetic to this. And look at all the ways that you can argue for this that is already adopted or argued for in local and regional plans. You need to continue to demonstrate public support through your media, social media, events, action alerts, reaching out to your elected officials, and provide the data, the fact sheet, the responses, the memos. I've written like 1 million memos responding to every critique of this for these council members, basically. and, continuously engage those legislators and their staff, that you understand, so that they know that you're there to work with them, that you have that you're bringing constituents to them, and work with your allies to make sure that you're always able to bring those constituents and allies or constituents to the legislators, so they know that those supporters are there, and mobilize and prepare for that hearing. Be persistent in terms of finding opportunities to reach those council members. We had volunteers. I was invited by a community leader to go to a community walkthrough because it was an opportunity to talk to the council member that we needed to talk to. At the end of our community walkthrough on a issue related to pedestrian safety, the guy who was leading the community leader who was leading this, said, I wanted to talk about this bill, and here's Cheryl to talk about this bill. And we had a conversation on the street about this bill. Be sure to track the political dynamics. As I said, we had the person who ended up voting for being our third vote had a primary challenger who popped up during this process, and then the other council member resigned. We weren't really courting him, but it certainly mitigated the negative sort of influence that he would have. Ultimately, when you get down to it, you're going to be deciding on compromises that are going to be acceptable or unacceptable, because amendments will be made to your bill. Try to have the last word of always being in touch with all your legislators and staff, and be sure to reward your legislators for supporting the bill. This is a photo of a wonderful volunteer collecting names at this Open Streets event. It was just a tremendous opportunity that just popped up and actually was recommended by an activist from this part of the city who said, oh, you should definitely canvass at this Open Streets event. It's a perfect place to do it. And I was like, oh no, this is just never going to work. And I was like, you know what? She's right. We got to do it. So we were able to muster the volunteer canvassers and go out and do it. I guess that's the end of my formal presentation. And I just wanted to note that on the right, flexible commuter benefits, that's our full report, which covers the focus group, which is something I think that people should definitely take a look at. And then on the left, we did an addendum, which sort of picked up where we left off in terms of finalizing, getting to the end, to getting the legislation passed. So that is, maybe I took a little too long, but I would love to hear what people are thinking about and working on.
All right. Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was great. And so with that, we want to jump right into the Q&A. Tina asks, how is the parking benefit calculated?
We really tried hard to keep the owned parking as a part of this benefit, and to basically, we spent a lot of time coming up with definitions for how you would be able to assess the market price of that parking space. In the end, we actually do still have some language about analyzing the market price, but really the benefit is simply calculated based on leased parking. So basically, an employer goes into the basement of their building and leases parking on a monthly basis, pretty much, and then that $150 or $200 benefit is simply converted into cash, or a combination of cash and a transit benefit. And then one of the compromises that we made was one of the employers who was supporting, but then kind of then became uncomfortable with cash out. We came up with an alternative that the employer could put the benefit, flex it from a parking benefit into a health benefit.
I see that Tony has a question.
You touched a bit on some of the opposition, but what is, I find this to be such a logical policy. I'm curious, what are the arguments that people give against implementing parking cash out?
It's upsetting the parking status quo, that it's always considered a good to provide more parking, basically. We finally found a human resources manager who was someone who I had actually known for a long time and was at a nonprofit. And so we were able to get more details. Basically, we actually ran these spreadsheets to show an alternative scenario, because this nonprofit was paying 100% of the parking costs. And I think it was they were like $160 or $200 a month, right? So a very substantial commute benefit. And if you biked or walked or rode transit, there might have been a transit benefit, but it would never equals what the way that the commute benefit law is set up. is it's supposed to be cover the cost of your commute. And so if your parking space costs $200, then that's what you can take as untaxable, although the laws have changed a little bit. It's a little bit more complicated than that now. But if you take transit and it costs you $50 a month to ride the bus to and from work, then that's what you can take for your benefit. So someone who drives gets a $200 benefit. Someone who takes the bus gets a $50 benefit. And then if you walk or bike, there are some employers were doing the $20 until they got rid of it. And then if you walk, you don't get anything. And that's actually, there's a large share of people walking to work. So changing the status quo is difficult. The sense that parking is a good, so what about the single mother who needs to drive to work and drop off her children at daycare and school? Are you saying you want to take your parking? No, we're not. We want to give people the choice so that they can choose what modes make the most sense for them. The challenge is that the practice is a very generous subsidy for parking and a much less generous subsidy for transit, or none for walking and biking. And so if you're going to level the playing field, would you redistribute the subsidy that you're, like, basically, if someone is offered a parking space and doesn't take a $200 parking benefit because they bike to work, well, now they could have $200 in cash instead. Well, that makes a lot of sense to that bicyclist. And so is that now a new expense that the employer hadn't planned on making in the commute because they expected only 3/4 of their workers to take the parking benefit? So that becomes sort of complicated. It's like, are you trying to take parking benefits or to reduce the parking benefit of someone who has it now? And then arguing for the walk bike benefit is not, I think it might depend on where you are, but for DC, it was not a fruitful pursuit. I don't work for a exclusively bike advocacy organization, so I'm sure it's challenging for my allies who do. But basically, walkers and bikers know who they are, and they were mostly our activists fighting for this. But I really highlighted that the lowest income commuter is by far the bus rider, and they could potentially really benefit from this. But all those things, it's like you're trying to take away a middle class driving benefit from people who are the main voters of a lot of these, council members, basically. And regulation, it's just a regulation. Look, why don't you, if an employer wants to provide a different kind of commute benefit, then they can.
Next, we have a question from Sean. He asks, are there results about yet in terms of how many or what percentage of employees utilize the cash outs, and or if it's led employers to reduce their parking footprints?
The law hasn't gone into effect yet. It's just kind of moving forward now. So basically, the way the law was structured is that an employer is responsible for offering cash out or offering alternatives to the parking space at the point that they no longer are have a sunk cost in a lease, as the lease expires, basically. And so then at that point, the employer isn't left holding the bag with a lease, having a double expense, right, of leasing a parking space and having an employee say, I'd rather take the cash and ride the bus and bike. So we don't have the results yet on that. But, from other research, it's looking at like a 10 to even 20% switch. And in fact, I think DC Federal Highway actually did some parking cash out research on this and showed, I think, about a 10% switch. Or it might have been, the data is sort of like, is it VMT? Is it trips? Or is it kind of proportion of the workforce that makes that change? But like you should expect something between 10 and 20% switch over.
We have a question from Joyce. She asks, how did you respond to the, quote, if they want to offer it, they can, don't impose regulation objection?
So, right. And I guess the other thing is that employers or opponents who were employers would say you're imposing a new cost on employers. And we're saying, no, you've already chosen to allocate a commute benefit. We just would like to make it in a form that would be more equitable, something that workers who might not own a car could use, since you've decided to offer this to your employees. Our argument is that I did try to get voluntary parking cash out programs, and was basically, I found a couple, but no one was interested really in doing that. It takes more to change that. I found a couple of examples, like one employer moved offices, and when they moved, they bought out they had the practice of offering a parking space for high paid or senior level staff. And so when they moved, they simply bought those out, cashed those out basically, because that had been the terms of that contract. So they cashed out employees who had received that perk basically. And when they moved to the new site, they provided no parking benefit whatsoever, and they gave all employees a corporate membership to our Capital Bike Share, and that was it. And so that's much cheaper, basically, than offering a parking benefit. But that's kind of the most change I found. And the other employer that I had mentioned before, they discontinued, when they got a new CEO, they discontinued the practice of providing any commute subsidy, which is really their parking subsidy, which was a big change. In terms of don't impose a regulation, there are a lot of impacts that we can demonstrate, that we've demonstrated through the data, that a free parking space has a huge impact on the commute patterns, the commute choices of workers, which actually has an overall impact on the city, on slowing down buses and people riding the bus because of all the traffic congestion, or basically unnecessary traffic congestion, the pollution, the crashes, all this sort of public interest sort of like concerns related to this unnecessary incentive to drive that doesn't necessarily meet the needs of employees and has a lot of negative impacts for the rest of us, for the city.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. We have a question from Jeffrey. So he asks, not sure how much this applies to DC, given the strong housing markets, but did the arguments ever come up of incentivizing residents to live in DC, sort of the opposite as free parking incentivizing sprawl? A parking cash out incentivizes the return to the city.
DC has, become a very in-demand place to live, and we really struggle with housing affordability is really our top issue. So I'm sort of having a hard time. I've lived here since it was a declining city with hemorrhaging population every year to one that is growing rapidly to growing and still growing at a moderate pace. I just think that parking cash out makes a lot of sense anywhere. It's where parking is very low value. There won't, and this was another argument we had a lot of, especially for the employers who are on the outskirts of downtown, not in downtown, but kind of the outer parts of the city, that parking isn't worth very much. So for them to give free parking, surface parking around their office building, would be we would say, well, the value and what is the market price in this context? Probably not very much. It costs money to ride the bus to that location. So it'd be nice if the floor was the same cost as it was to ride the bus, but parking in kind of low demand environment where there's a lot of cheap land basically is going to have a low price associated with it.
Next, we have a question from Alan Greenberg. Alan, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, Cheryl.
Hey, Alan.
It's not really a question. I was involved a lot as a citizen. I also worked for the federal government, but under the previous administration, they were very in love with this. So all my work and what I did in DC was allowable, but kind of low key. So I was involved, and I just want to commend Cheryl. I mean, I'd forgotten many of the things that were some of those details. I want to add just a few things listening to the discussion. First off, one thing that's particularly unique about DC, which is different than the California bill, is that the market values are very high, and the cash out value is based on the market value. And that means that the benefit, and Cheryl was talking about the outskirts where the costs are a little bit lower, but in a relative sense, the costs, the price of parking is quite high. And so the value of the benefit is high and much higher in most cases than what people would pay to get to work in any other way. So there's cash even after you're, say, supporting paying for a transit commute. It was a bit of a game of whack-a-mole in the sense that if it was a combination of telling people that whatever they raised as a concern wasn't, and we'd explain it, or
we wrote another memo on it.
Yes, we wrote a lot of memos. But so in terms of certainly the allowance for shifting the money to the employee portion of the health benefit, because some employers say, hey, we do all these great things, or we'd like to do it another way. And if it was real and the employee would recognize that benefit, we were happy with that. The health benefit, and some employers said we didn't want to be bothered. And we said, well, you have two options. We had a you just pay a fee option. The fee was pretty high, and you wouldn't really want to do it. It wouldn't make a lot of sense. I think it's $100 a month per spot. Why do that and give it to the government when you can give a benefit to your employee? The other comment we always made was they didn't have to offer parking. That was always an option. And the broader argument that we had with institutions, we had a bunch of them saying we're already doing all this TDM planning.
Right.
So there is a TDM plan out, but it's actually a pretty stringent requirement. The district has a very tight, tough SOV commute mode share goal. And the TDM plan has to actually approach that goal, get 10% closer every year, or they lose the option of not cashing out. So we were okay with them if their program really, really works, but you're not really going to get people not driving if giving them parking and not equivalent benefits. So we did all of those things. Another sort of argument we made was we said, look, the employers have control here. They never have to spend more money than they're spending now. So it is worth noting that some number of employees who are offered a benefit aren't taking it today. And so there are costs if you just leave the benefit just as it is. The ones who actually weren't parking and no longer parking, yes, the employer can recoup that value through subletting the parking. But there are some actual costs. So the spreadsheets that Cheryl was talking about essentially said, well, here's different ways of doing it. Here's an option where you can have no cost to the employer. So the employee would have to pay a bit for parking that they weren't paying before, but the whole spreadsheet amount would sort of equal out. So the control sort of remained in the employer's hands. There's one final comment I want to make related to equity, and that is it didn't play out quite as smoothly as we thought. It seemed a very obvious thing that poorer people are going to drive less, have fewer cars in the household. But some of the council members who represent the poorer districts, they were sometimes focused on the fact that the parking benefits themselves were going to the higher wage workers. So we had to say, well, even if that's occurring, you still have the lower wage folks within a group getting a benefit are the ones who are most likely to take advantage of it. The one compelling argument at a city level, I thought, was that if you look, and Andrea Hammer had done some really great research that we took advantage of. If you look at how people are getting to work to begin with, the people coming out of the city are much more likely to be driving into the city. And so we said, well, why is it that DC employers can favor out-of-town commuters driving into our city and disadvantage our own residents in the benefits that they offer? And that was an argument. I thought that went pretty well. But anyway, I want to thank, I see Dr. Shoup is in the call, and particularly for being the great inspiration and writing so much about
the father of parking cash out.
Father of parking cash out. To recognize you there. But thanks, Cheryl. A great presentation.
Thanks, Alan, for all your great work.
The next question, we have Paul. He's asking, do you see any possibility that experience with this might later lead to extending this to the employer-owned parking that is currently exempted? Or maybe publicity about parking cash out by employers with leased parking might put pressure on the universities and others to be more open to this?
Yeah, maybe. And I think, two things. One is that in the compromise to exempt owned parking, which was very painful for us, they did something that was smart. It actually only excludes existing owned parking. So if an employer, they probably will figure out how to do it if they have multiple campuses. But basically, in the future, if you acquire new owned parking, that shouldn't be part of this. So that's at least one thing that would be helpful. I think that DC requires that universities do campus plans and the city planning staff and transportation staff have progressively gotten more out of those campus plans from a transportation demand management perspective. They're now doing parking caps rather than minimum parking requirements for those campus plans. And that was one of the things like university said, we can't do this because we have a minimum. So you're gonna hurt us by saying we have to maintain this parking space on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're supposed to cash them out. So doing the parking cap is a really important step forward, but they do them campus plan by campus plan. So that's really good. Hospitals do not have campus plans unless they're basically tied to a university. And that I found to be the most frustrating because we just need so much more innovation in the healthcare hospital space. And they seem to be the most resistant to innovation. And there were just the most ridiculous examples of basically hospitals charging a lot of money to park if you're a visitor and ridiculously low or free if you're a worker, and then the parking spaces being allocated by seniority. So I feel like the hospitals have a really long way to go to adopting more progressive. Look, I harped on Seattle Children's Hospital TDM plan all the time, but I found it really hard to break into the hospital scene. And we sort of have the farthest to go with them. With universities, I am hopeful that we can move them, but they like to split. I will say, I feel like they're cheating. They always like to split out their mode split by saying, our students are mostly riding the shuttle and riding the bikes and walking, and basically to cover up for the subsidies they're providing to their staff.
Okay, very interesting. So we have time for one last question. So Michael, he asks, do you have any thoughts on pursuing a commute trip reduction law that includes cash outs as strategy versus a law exclusively focused on cash outs?
I'm going to ask Alan about this. We really considered that as we were kind of getting nowhere on our parking cash out legislation. I don't know. Parking cash out is like just a really direct intervention of like the root of the problem, basically.
Sure, we have that option. If it's essentially the employers can have a TDM plan that is
right, but it's more like the Seattle model, right, where basically Seattle businesses are driven to parking cash out and other innovative approaches because of the commute reduction legislation. I don't know that that's any easier than winning parking cash out, and I feel like parking subsidy is sort of the root of all urban evil, basically.
Yeah, we challenged them to meet it any way they could. Some of them said, we're doing so much so that's so incredible, we shouldn't have to do this too. And so this was I guess if they were doing the cash out, they wouldn't have to do the other. But you really can't meet, the goal is really difficult. You really can't meet it by, maybe if you're a big hospital and you give 3 people free parking, you can meet it and you've got a few hundred employees, but largely there's no way you can get it. It's a 25% SOV commute cap is the goal. And we say that whatever rate you're at, you're supposed to get 10% closer every year. It's a really, really tough standard to meet. There's no way you're going to meet it if you're continuing to just give parking away and not offer the equivalent.
So that concludes tonight's events. And if you're not a member already of the Parking Informed Network, please consider joining and check out our website, parkinginformed.org, for more about how to be a member. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.